Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your source material, find the key insights, and help you get informed fast. Today, we're digging into an article from The Economist. It's all about the Trump administration and its approach to science and research funding. So our mission really is to get why the article claims these things are happening and what the author sees as the consequences, short-term, long-term, for the U.S. and, well, globally too. And the article doesn't pull punches. It starts by describing the situation as fast and furious attacks on the U.S. scientific community.
That's definitely a strong way to put it. And the sources we looked at, they list some pretty specific actions to back that up. We're talking about thousands of research grants apparently canceled, billions of dollars withheld from scientists.
Billions, wow. That definitely makes you sit up.
Yeah.
And it names names, too, like Harvard and Columbia projects getting, abruptly cut off?
Exactly. And it's not just stopping individual projects. The piece mentions a proposed budget measure, a big one, could slash funding by maybe even 50% from the main U.S. research funding agencies.
50%. That's not tweaking, is it? That sounds fundamental. So, okay, the administration, according to the article, people like Michael Kratsios, they have a reason for this, a stated logic.
Yeah, there's a stated logic. As the piece lays it out, it's this belief that science needs a real shakeup. The view is that it's become inefficient, sclerotic even, and kind of captured by groupthink. Especially the article notes concerning things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives.
Okay, so the official line is reform, efficiency, tackling groupthink. But the article pushes back on that pretty quickly, doesn't it? It suggests these actions aren't really targeted reforms, more like unfocused and disingenuous attacks.
That's a key point the author makes, yeah. They argue these moves aren't precise surgical strikes against inefficiency. They often seem like, well, collateral damage linked to bigger political goals.
And what are those bigger goals, according to the article?
Well, the source links these actions to things like stamping out DEI programs, maybe punishing universities over anti-Semitism issues, and just generally cutting government spending. There's this perception, the author explains, that some scientists are pushing, quote, woke thinking.
Right, and this feeling, this kind of aversion,
yeah,
it's made grant makers, the source says, almost allergic to certain topics, even certain words.
Precisely. The article uses that exact word, allergic, to terms like trans or equity. And the really worrying thing, as the author sees it, isn't just stopping projects seen as woke. It's that this is leading to cuts in orthodox science, too.
Orthodox science, what does that mean in this context? Are there examples?
Yeah, the piece gives examples like funding being cut for studies looking at cancer risk factors by race, or research on how common sexually transmitted diseases are broken down by sex. The author argues these aren't, fringe topics, but maybe their wording or their focus on demographics gets perceived as linked to DEI, and that makes them vulnerable to this allergy.
Okay, this is where it gets really strange. The article calls it an illogical extreme. It talks about elite universities like Harvard and Columbia being targeted.
Yeah, the article really emphasizes this point. The funding cuts there, they apparently haven't been just about specific research areas deemed controversial. No, it seems like funding for research across the board, Alzheimer's, quantum physics, you name it, has been stopped.
All subjects.
That's what's reported. So the author presents this less as reform and more as a kind of broad punishment.
And is there a specific type of science the article says is getting special attention, a particular target?
Yes, it points to public health and climate researchers. The source suggests some people see them as finger-wagging worrywarts, because of COVID lockdown, school closures, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the expectation laid out in the article is that spending on vaccine research and climate science could see the absolute most vicious cuts.
Wow. And this leads to maybe an even deeper concern the article raises. Beyond just the money, it talks about officials potentially trying to say what scientists can even study.
That's right. The source describes it as attempts to impose new rules telling scientists that certain areas of research are basically off limits.
Yeah, off limits.
Yeah. The author calls that a shocking step backwards, away from, Enlightenment values of free thinking that America's supposedly built on. So it moves beyond just budgets, potentially into directing scientific thought itself.
Okay, but the article does find one point where it kind of agrees with the critique of science from someone like Mr. Kratsios, right? About bureaucracy.
It does concede that point, yeah. The piece agrees there is too much bureaucracy in American science. It even cites researchers saying they spend like 2 days out of 5 just on admin tasks, not in the lab.
2 out of 5 days? That's a lot. So the inefficiency problem is real. But the author's point is, these actions by the administration, they aren't actually fixing it. They're making things worse.
Exactly. The article argues all this uncertainty about funding, a scientist maybe needing to launch legal challenges. It actually makes the whole scientific process less efficient, not more.
So yeah, agreement on the problem of red tape. But the argument is the solution being applied isn't working and it's causing these other huge problems.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those. What are the immediate, like, real-world harms the article points to?
Well, it details several things beyond just labs shutting down. For instance, it talks about savage cuts to NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the weather people.
Right.
And the argument is those cuts mean worse weather forecasts, which, has a direct impact on farmers planting crops or communities getting ready for hurricanes or floods.
Okay, that's concrete. And public health impacts, too.
Yeah, cuts to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The article highlights that this makes it harder to track and stop disease outbreaks. So real effects on public safety, national preparedness.
And thinking longer term. The article seems skeptical that private companies will just step in and fund all the basic research if public funding gets cut.
That's a key economic point it makes. You see, basic research, it's fundamental. It often doesn't have an obvious product you can sell right away. It might take years, decades even, before it leads to something commercial.
Right, it's foundational.
Exactly. And public money is crucial for that kind of long game work. Business R&D, the article notes, usually focuses on shorter-term stuff. Applied research with a clearer path to profit, they're funding different kinds of things, fundamentally.
Which leads to another big long-term worry.
Yeah.
The article flags this idea of a brain drain, and it has some pretty stark numbers.
Yeah, the data points in the article are quite concerning. It says in the first 3 months of this year, applications from U.S. scientists for jobs overseas went up by 1/3, compared to the same time in 2024.
1/3. In just 3 months. That's fast. What about scientists wanting to come to the U.S.?
That's the other side of the coin. The source says applications from foreign researchers wanting to work in America fell by 1/4 in that same time frame.
1/4 down.
Yeah. And the article warns if this keeps up, America's reputation as the place to be for top global talent, that could be damaged. And regaining that reputation, that's really hard.
And there's also a kind of internal concern about self-censorship among the scientists who do stay.
The article definitely raises that possibility, a potential chilling effect. If scientists start to feel like academic freedom is shrinking or that certain research topics are politically dangerous,
We might just avoid them.
they might just start to self-censor, limit the questions they even ask, and that could have ripple effects for years.
So zooming onto the really big picture, the article puts America's role in global science right at the center of the argument.
It really emphasizes how big a player the U.S. is, the biggest public research funder in the world, home to half the Science Nobel Prize winners. 4 of the top 10 research universities globally are American.
Huge influence.
Wow. And U.S. innovations, things like the internet, mRNA vaccines, they've changed the world, benefited everyone.
And the author's argument follows from that. If the U.S. steps back from this leadership role, the world gets robbed of the fruits of this ingenuity.
That's the global impact argued in the piece, yes. But then it pivots right back, stressing that America itself will feel the pain most of all.
Right, making a direct link between America's past success, its economy, its tech, its military power, and its scientific leadership.
The source definitely draws that line. It notes how the U.S. wasn't really leading in science at the start of the 20th century, but by the end, it led in almost everything, and argues that this scientific dominance was tangled up with America's overall success.
And the article lands on a really potent conclusion, that taking these actions means the U.S. is giving up vital ground, potentially letting competitors like China take over as the world's scientific superpower.
Yeah, it frames this whole thing, this assault on science, not just as a policy debate, but ultimately as an act of self-harm for the U.S.
So wrapping up our deep dive into this economist analysis, there's this clear tension presented. On one hand, the administration's stated aim: reform science, make it efficient, fight groupthink. On the other, the author's argument: these are unfocused attacks, driven by politics, causing widespread harm, and actually making science less efficient.
It definitely leaves you thinking, especially about those fundamental principles the author brings up. Like, what does it really mean for a country supposedly built on free thinking values, as the article puts it, to start potentially fencing off areas of scientific research?
Yeah, and building on that argument from the source,
Right.
what are the real long-term consequences for America's economy, its tech edge, its place in the world? If that core scientific foundation starts to look shaky, that's certainly something to mull over after reading this piece.